Welcome to The Forgotten, Episode 10, Part 2, The Saxon Waterloo. Autumn is coming closer in the year of 1813. As the Allied forces approach, we can picture a man sitting in a house in Reutnitz close to Leipzig. The Emperor of the French was not in a great situation, both physically and militarily. Although he had assembled all of his forces available in the German theatre, an impressive 190,000 men and almost 700 guns, he was still woefully inferior to the forces approaching to finally ensnare and kill the beast himself, who had been one of the most daring and most successful leaders in the history of humankind. Furthermore, he was suffering from a severe chronic gastritis, which had already paved the way for severe stomach cancer. Nonetheless, his will was unbroken. He wanted to win this war, the way he had won so many wars before. Marengo, Austerlitz, Jena and Auerstedt, Wagram. The idea that a decisive battle in which his genius would play out and he'd simply outsmart his adversaries was his greatest desire. So he had called all his great paladins. Poniatowski, Marmont, Ney, and many others, names who would strike fear into the hearts of his enemies. But his enemies had tasted blood. After the disasters at Großbeeren and the Katzbach, his initial plan to capture Berlin was fouled anyways. So, what chance did he have? We can only imagine how the Emperor of the French must have felt. He must have feared this conversation, as it was a make or break, just like Marengo. This time, however, the winner would not be him, and no miraculous attack would save him. The situation on the other side was not as brilliant as it might seem. Although the advance was working out just fine, Napoleon had humiliated the Bohemian army and its commander, Fürst Karl von Schwarzenberg, at Dresden. Schwarzenberg, also the supreme commander of the Allied forces, a stern demand of the Austrian Empire while negotiating this coalition entry, was understandably furious. Yet, this defeat had merely slowed down the approach, and the concentric move for Leipzig, where the Emperor of the French arrived on the 14th of October, was continued. This time I will leave Gneisenau by the side a little, as I want, like Jena and Auerstedt, focus on the battler. Of course, his voice will be heard, as he was one of the leading figures of the battle, but I will focus more on what happened, and I will try to depict this harrowing slaughter in the way that best suits the dear listener. The approach on Leipzig was, as I said, not an easy one. The quick advance had put the limited supply capacity to a hard test, and the area was, mostly because of the guerrilla war and the Cossack raids, not far from desolation. Food was short. Ammunition was also not abundant. On the 3rd of October, the Prusso-Russian Silesian army crossed the Elbe at Elster, defeating the bulk of two corps who had tried to prevent them from crossing by pinning them at the front while surpassing their flank and make their position unmaintainable. Gneisenau reported to his wife, "We have crossed the Elbe not too far from Wittenberg." Again, only the Prussians fought. "We have captured a nice amount of guns and 70 ammo carriages after a hard battle that lasted 5 hours. Our cavalry is on pursuit. The Landwehr has fought brilliantly. August is well. May God's grace be with you." This Elbe crossing, called the Battle of Wartenburg, quite coincidentally, Count Georg von Wartenburg, the mind behind the Tauroggen Convention, was the commander of the attacking corps, had forced Napoleon to leave the city of Dresden for Leipzig. The encirclement became reality. Gneisenau, however, was quite unhappy. He had gotten reports from Berlin that the king was not entirely happy with him being Scharnhorst's replacement, as over the last years he had thought of Gneisenau as something of a revolutionary, thanks in part to Ancillon, and his age, mind that he was almost 53 at this point, did not make the exhausting campaign much easier. Additionally, as he had confessed to Hardenberg in a letter, the situation at home was not too great. His wife was more than upset over his long absence and having to deal with both the kids and the estate alone. He also informed Hardenberg that his absolutely favorite position, which would allow him to both being near his family and still serving the kingdom, would be the office of Postmaster General, as he could not possibly make the royal post's condition worse than it already was. Yet, on the 16th of October, the day had come. After several cavalry skirmishes, the Battle of Leipzig, the Völkerschlacht, the Battle of the Nations, commenced. Gneisenau's personal adjutant, 2nd Lieutenant Theodor Ferdinand Stosch, wrote about his commander. I do still see Gneisenau's beaming phrase in front of me, as the thundering of the guns was heard around Leipzig on this 16th of October. The combination of factors graced by the will of the Almighty, who had allowed the Allied armies to meet here, already predicted the liberation of Germany from the French yoke. Every favorable report made his eyes shine brighter, his spirit more vivid and fiery. This very interesting observation also made me feel the boldest hopes. There was more than enough reason to rejoice. Napoleon's force was pressed against the river Weiße Elster, literally the White Magpie, the river running through Leipzig, and beset by the army consisting out of 205,000 men and over 900 guns on the first day only. Later this number would increase drastically. Those men would come from Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, many German states, from as far as modern-day Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, as well as Britain, which had sent, among others, a battery of Congreve rockets. For the next 3 days, the area around Leipzig would become witness to the greatest European battle ever fought to this point, and it was cost hecatombs of lives. The German historian Hans-Ulrich Thamer has called this battle the first Saxon Waterloo. In his excellent book about the Battle of Leipzig, Europe's fight against Napoleon, which will be also my main source for this episode. The encirclement was not yet complete. The Crown Prince of Sweden, Bernadotte, the former French Marshal, slowed down his advance. This of course made his allies rethink his loyalties. But Napoleon still knew about his advance and did not attempt to break out there. Instead, he massed his forces against Schwarzenberg to the south, who was accompanied by both the Tsar and King Frederick William. Schwarzenberg wanted to bypass the French forces, using both a part of his own forces and the Prussians coming from the north as a decoy, while his main Bohemian army was to perform this action. This action would fail. Napoleon was not a fool that he could have been tricked so easily. Well-fortified positions at the village of Wachau, especially concerning the artillery, which Napoleon still was the undisputed master of, and the presence of the Emperor himself made the attack fail under great losses, so dire that the Allied army was on the brink of defeat. A massed cavalry charge of Napoleon's Guard cavalry, which should have decided the battle in his favor, even reached Schwarzenberg and the two monarchs, but finally collapsed. The front had not moved much in the south on this day. The Prussians were the only ones to make real progress. Blücher, still firmly in command of the Silesian army coming from the north, completely disregarded the orders of Schwarzenberg to be a decoy force, and attacked with a full force of 2 corps from the north. Blücher, already 70 at this point, was a character unrivaled in the history of warfare. The old man had been serving under Frederick II in the 7 Years' War and the Silesian Wars already. Yet he had been bypassed when he was due for promotion to major and left the Prussian army in protest. A choice which the Prussian king commented by saying, "Rittmeister Blücher can go to hell." He had still rejoined the military after Frederick's death and became one of the heroes in the aftermath of the Battle of Jena and Auerstedt, as he and his forces retreated towards Lübeck, Scharnhorst by his side, defeating the French pursuers time and again and finally surrendering their honor intact. The old man was quite the drunkard and, according to some sources, quite mad. Following a popular tale, he frequently insisted that he was impregnated by an elephant, thus explaining his rather corpulent figure. On other occasions, he would go through his room only on his tiptoes, firmly believing that the French had heated up the floor of his quarters scorchingly hot. Yet the old man, called Marschall Vorwärts, Marshal Forward, and Uncle Blücher by his men, was a dashing officer, a great talent in the offensive and a cavalryman by heart. The troops loved his whims and his temper, and he was immensely popular with them. He would later be the only one to ever receive a special version of the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross, called the Blücherstern, Blücher's Star, for his meritorious service as a commander of the Prussian troops in the War of Liberation and the Waterloo campaign. Together with a capable chief of staff, he could be considered the almost perfect commander. His swift attack caught Marshal Marmont's corps off guard and quickly shattered it. So, in the end, the forces who had been told to stand their ground had, as so often in history, made the biggest progress and, most importantly, had prevented Napoleon from reinforcing his attack against Schwarzenberg at Wachau. By nightfall, the battle ceased. As the second day of the battle was quite calm, I will use this point to talk about the harrowing conditions for the soldiers in this battle. Food was scarce on both sides. The conditions for the wounded were absolutely terrible. No shelter was available. The mass of the army was encamped on the fields. There was literally no chance to save the wounded. For the French, supplies were even shorter, as the only way out of the city was packed with refugees and wagons, and the connections to what little full depots the French still had was under constant attack of Cossack squadrons. Think of what it must have been like to sleep in the rain and cold, hearing the wounded moan and scream, hungry, beset from all sides, maybe even ravaged by diarrhea and several skin infections, as well as all the other ghastly diseases which stem from a lack of hygiene and food. It is indisputable that none of us would change with a common French soldier for all the money in the world. Still, on this day, Bernadotte and his army finally arrived, bringing another 100,000 men to the field, as well as over 500 new guns. The next day began with Napoleon forfeiting his rather extremely stretched position. This did not help too long, as the Allied armies started their general attack at 7 a.m. The concentric attack finally broke through the lines, especially at the southern front for a rather unexpected reason. A Saxon infantry force of around 4,500 men and around 500 cavalrymen from Württemberg switched sides. This gap in the front line allowed Levin August von Bennigsen, yes, the Bennigsen of Preußische Eylau and Friedland, to deliver a killing blow to the French position. Bernadotte, however, was reluctant to send his forces into the battle. Luckily for the Allies, some of his commanders disobeyed orders and put additional pressure on the front line. In the afternoon, Napoleon finally conceded defeat. His idea to make the Allied forces bleed out and start a decisive counterattack had failed. He was now in a position that could not be maintained anymore. So he finally decided to retreat over the Weiße Elster. The only bridge over this river, which the French could use for their retreat, was absolutely packed, and there was no chance that the army of the French Empire could pass it in its entirety. Enter the panicking officer of the engineers. Being irritated by the screams of the retreating soldiers, that Blücher was hot on their heels, although this was not possibly true, as his request to pursue the French with a massive cavalry force had been denied before, the officer, whose name is not known to us, decided to blow the bridge, with men on it, and with a large portion of the army still on the wrong side of the river. Good job, man. You do deserve a promotion to Swiss cheese, which is a nice German term for saying someone should be executed. Although one might laugh about this story, it was a terrible tragedy. Just as at the Berezina in Russia, less than 1 year before, panic beset the still remaining soldiers. Many tried to swim through the river, which did not work more often than not, causing so many to drown. Marshal Poniatowski, one of Napoleon's most capable commanders, was wounded several times and drowned as well. 300 guns had to be left behind on the wrong side, as well as tens of thousands of prisoners. Overall, this battle had cost the French more than 70,000 men in dead, wounded and prisoners, of which 30,000 were taken. The Allied army lost around 55,000 men. The amount of corpses was so large that, after the battle was over, the city of Leipzig, already as destroyed as it could be after the Allies finally charged in, was ravaged by several epidemic waves of typhus. Stosch wrote that Gneisenau, in the aftermath of the battle, seeing the many dead and wounded, uttered the phrase, "This victory was very costly, and it was paid for with German blood," and that he shed a tear after that, the only time Stosch had seen him crying. The letter to his wife, which did of course not depict all those cruelties, ended with a familiar "August is well. Embrace the kids from me." I do strongly recommend everyone who visits Leipzig to visit the museums and exhibitions about the battle, and of course the huge Völkerschlachtdenkmal, opened in 1913 at the 100th anniversary of the battle, one of the greatest symbols of Imperial German nationalism and truly a sight to behold. I hope that European nations will never again have to engage in this barbaric slaughter against each other, and I hope that this battle, which has caused so much grief on the whole continent, will become a sign for peace and unity in all of Europe. I wish you a good day, or a good night. See you next time.